Moving on to the cohort study design. And this is a design that I find is easier to convey through the use of examples, so I will include quite a few examples in this presentation. So first off, what is a cohort? And this is not the same as a cohort study. I'm talking about what is a singular cohort. A cohort is a population that I'm following over time for the occurrence of a given outcome. I sometimes talk about closed cohorts. That is a group of individuals that I'm following from a given point in time. I will know later then add in additional individuals, and I'll follow everyone until the event of interest or the study period ends, or they migrate or die or whatever. And an open cohort, sometimes also called a dynamic cohort, is a population that is changing over time. Individuals can move in and out of the cohort during the observation period. So this is a cohort of individuals I'm following over time, sometimes closed, sometimes open. The closed can be graphically denoted as this, or the open or the dynamic can be denoted such as this. The use of the open versus closed cohort thinking is typically of very little value, as long as you know and have been explicit about who am I following from when and until when. That's the core thing. And of course, it makes sense to note whether people can re-enter the cohort, for instance, but it's not like we have study designs for open cohort designs or closed cohort designs. This is just causing additional confusion. So get rid of the terms, but be specific about when is when followed and until when. The cohort design, that is, we follow people over time until the occurrence of an outcome, or censoring leaving the cohort through other ways. And we will tally the number of follow-up, so how long have we followed these individuals for, and the number of outcomes. So here we have 108 person years and we saw 3 events, and we can translate that, the number of person years observation time and the number of events or outcomes, into, for instance, an incidence rate. I could compare 2 cohorts. I could say the incidence rate in one group was 28 per 100,000 or 100,000 person years, and another cohort would be, for instance, 20 per 1,000 person years, which will yield me an incidence rate ratio of 1.4. So this is the core idea. I'm measuring outcome and follow-up in 2 different groups and comparing them. However, it very quickly turns more complicated than this, because here I have only divided people into use and non-use of a drug. But we could also consider other metrics. It could be calendar time and it could be age. So here I have 2 individuals. One is followed from 1970 until 1995. The other one is also followed from 1970 but only until 1983. These are of different ages. One is age 30 upon initiation and of the study, and the other is age 35. And the one is using the drug from 75 until 1990, the other using the drug from 75 until 83, upon which there is an outcome. So we now not only have to measure the number of person time and outcomes in group exposed and unexposed, but also subdivide this into age and calendar time. So if we are only considering age, it would look something like this. So in these 5-year age buckets, we have this amount of exposed and unexposed time and number of outcomes. And this is one way to handle confounding. We'll get back to that later. But again, in a typical cohort study, we need to keep track of multiple things. And this can become increasingly complicated, in particular if we are looking at different exposures and these are time varying. So for instance, this individual is followed from January 1st, 2001 until December 31st, 2014. And we have these 2 prescription periods of using either ACE and NSAID. And if we combine the 2, it looks like this. So this individual is now contributing person time to 3 brackets. One of, if you only consider the ASA use or the low dose aspirin use, we have 3 brackets. First non-use, then ASA use, and then non-use again. each of these ending with no outcome. So one person is split into multiple instances, or the person time from one person is split into multiple instances. If you also consider the NSAID use, this is now where we're getting to the more complicated part, where we see this person being split into increasingly fine strata of person time, according to here 2 different exposure metrics. So the core idea of just following one cohort and another cohort sounds simple, but we want to make sure they are comparable, and sometimes this following of person time requires splitting into different categories of person time. As a very simple example of a cohort study, consider this study where we looked at the use of methylphenidate in utero and risk of malformations. This is almost a person time free cohort study in that we're looking at malformations present at birth. So here we have the basic comparison of those with in utero exposure to methylphenidate and non-exposure. And we are looking at major malformations as the main outcome. So among 222 exposed pregnancies, we saw 7 children born with a malformation. In the other group, we identified 2,220 pregnancies not exposed to methylphenidate, and in that group, we saw 86 different children being born with a major malformation. And this is sort of the simplest instance where we can compare 2 groups, and this yields a relative measure of risk here of 0.8, in that the occurrence of the outcome is slightly lower among those exposed compared to those unexposed. Can of course also in the same cohort study look at other outcomes. For instance, this is the major malformations. We could also restrict this from all major to only cardiac malformations, which would yield something like this. So we can use different outcome metrics in this cohort, but in this very simple situation, we don't have any particular follow-up. It's just a matter of exposed, unexposed, outcome, no outcome. Here is one of my favorite examples to illustrate this person time subdivision. This is a study performed by Garcia Rodriguez, published almost 3 decades ago in epidemiology, on the use of NSAID and upper gastrointestinal bleeding in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan. So here there is the description of how this study cohort, and actually here there's a singular study cohort, and you are included in the cohort upon first prescription of a prescription for, or first received of a prescription for diclofenac, indomethacin, naproxen, piroxicam, or sulindac. So 5 different individual NSAIDs, and using any of these will get you included in the cohort. Person time is then contributed until hospitalization due to the outcome, death, departure, or end of study period. So we are basically following one cohort that are comprised of users of these 5 individual NSAIDs. There is no specific control group, at least not a control cohort. So within this group of NSAID users, all their person time is stratified into current use, which is defined as having a prescription filled within the last month, recent use, no prescription within the last month, but 1 month prior to that, then 60 to 150 days from last prescription, and non-use defined as more than 150 days has lapsed since your prescription. Everyone in this cohort is a user at some point, so non-use will correspond to sort of long time since use and not never use. So any given individual included in the cohort could look like this: only filling 1 prescription, then you contributed 30 days of use, 30 days of recent past use, 90 days of old past use, and then you are considered a non-user here for 1,300 days until the study is ended. So 2 different users could look like this. One was the one I mentioned before, only 1 prescription, use, first current use, then recent past, then old past, then non-use. So that person time is distributed or put into 4 different bins. Another person with the second line here is a user, and then still a user because a new prescription is filled, and then still a current user because a new prescription is filled, then a recent past, and then an old past user, and here censored due to an outcome event. So here we are tallying the number of days, person days, contributed by these two persons into current and recent past and old past and non-use, and the number of events. Here the person 2 with the one event. So this is one way of doing it, and here we have no particular reference cohort, because basically we, in most of these studies, don't really care about the single individual, but just the person time. And instead of comparing the users to non-users, we are here comparing person time considered current, recent, or old past exposed to person time considered as non-exposed. So within these 4 buckets of current use, recent use, old past use, and non-use, we are tallying all the person time and the outcome events, and we are using the non-use as a reference person time. So we are dividing the incidence rates in all the 3 other buckets with the incidence rates in the non-user buckets. And from this, we obtain these estimates of a 4-fold increased incidence rate with current use, 2-fold increase with recent past, 1.4 with old past, relative to the number of events, or the rate of events among the non-users. The final example is this one, also somewhat similar to the Saskatchewan study. This was triggered by a news bulletin on the use of Warfarin in a generic version might cause bleeding events. And we looked at this in this study published in PDS. So we wanted to see whether switching from branded Warfarin to generic Warfarin was associated with an increased risk of bleeding. So we had to again divide the cohort of Warfarin users into the time of interest for this switch. So in one cohort, or one bucket of person time, we had the continuous use of branded Warfarin. So when you filled a branded Warfarin prescription, you contributed to this. We also have the continuous use for generic Warfarin. So you can be a continuous user, keep filling the generic Warfarin for an extended period of time, and you would contribute person time and outcome to this sub-cohort. There could also be the recent switch to generic Warfarin. That is, you had to have filled branded Warfarin and then a new prescription for a generic Warfarin, and we considered an individual to contribute to this particular sub-cohort of buckets within the first 60 days of having filled this prescription for the generic, requiring a previous fill for a branded Warfarin, and obviously also vice versa. Across the entire cohort of all Warfarin users, some person time will not fall into any of these buckets. For instance, the time after filling your absolute first prescription doesn't qualify for any of these. And also the person time after a switch after the first 60 days and until the next prescription filled doesn't qualify into any of these. And this is absolutely intentional to reduce misclassification. This is the person time we are reasonably certain correspond to the exposure of interest. So now we have use of one another, the switch in one direction, switch in another direction. And within each of these 4, and looking at the combined outcome here called excessive anticoagulation, which was both a major bleeding event or being hospitalized due to excessive anticoagulation, that is very high INR levels after having had too much Warfarin. And within each of these buckets of person follow-up, we identified the number of outcome events, the amount of follow-up. This translated into a rate. So within these 4 buckets, we had a rate of events, and using the continuous use of the branded as a reference, we divided, for instance, the switch to generic, the rate of 27 with the rate of 25, yielding a incidence rate ratio of 1.4. Here it's denoted as a hazard ratio because we used a Cox model, which is slightly different mathematically, but yields a very similar result. So these are the basic examples of cohort studies, and the idea of monitoring person time, not persons, per se, because in many of these examples, for instance, the Saskatchewan NSAID example or the Warfarin generic versus branded example, each individual can and will often contribute to very many of these individual cohorts, but we are monitoring the person time and the outcomes according to exposure.